Well, good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Thyroid Trust, I'd like you to welcome to a Zoom seminar entitled Evening with Billy Kenber, and he's going to be discussing his book, Sick Money. Now, the format of the evening is that Billy has prepared talk lasting about 30 minutes, going through the various issues, and he's aware we're going to be focusing on liothyronine. I'm an endocrinologist based in London, and so I'm here to help him a little with the clinical aspects, but I think from reading his book you'll be aware he's probably more qualified than most endocrinologists on this particular area. So it'll be interesting to hear how he sees it from the clinical side as well. After Billy's talk, there's going to be a format, there's going to be a brief update by Lorraine Williams, who's director of the Thyroid Trust, on some latest news regarding availability of liothyronine, and she's going to update us about a meeting at the House of Lords. And during the talk, and it will give people a bit of time to reflect, there is a chat room, which and the format we're going to use for the Q&A, because it does get quite difficult with a large group, is that if you can put your questions, if there are any, as you're going through the talk, into the chat room, and then with your name, and then Karen is going to kindly just transfer them to a Google document where I can see the questions as they're coming through, and so at the end of the talk we can go through some of those questions as well. So Lorraine, is there anything else I need to cover before we move to the introduction?
No, I don't think
so it's a great pleasure to introduce Billy. I've just realised he's probably about 2 miles away from me in West Hampstead, by the way, so I can see you at the lower part of the hill, Billy. I'm up in Belsize Park, so I can just about see you.
I'm actually over in East London now, but not too far. Yeah.
So Billy's an investigative journalist at the Times, and he's been there since 2010, which by the look of him looks like he started when he was about 11. And he's an award-winning journalist, and he actually won the 2017 award for outstanding contribution to health on medical journalism, and I suspect that probably was based on his work when he exposed the issue with liothyronine in the Times in 2016. And as you may recall, at that time, the price of liothyronine had increased by over 6,000%, and it led to a significant change in clinical practice in the UK, primarily driven by the cost. More recently, Billy's reported on the CMA having handed out a fine to the pharmaceutical company involved with Advance, who took advantage of their sole manufacturing capacity in the UK and increased the price so significantly. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Billy, who's going to give an update really on the wider issues within the pharmaceutical industry, but principally based on liothyronine. And as I said, we've got lots of time at the end to catch up and do some question and answering as well. So welcome to everyone, and thank you very much, Billy, for your time this evening.
Oh,
thanks, Mark.
We should just also say to everyone that we are recording this session.
Oh yes, sorry, yeah.
The aim is to make it available afterwards.
Yeah, so there is the meeting will be recorded, and so there will be it will be online afterwards. So Billy, your book, I'll just better give you the hard sell for the book as well. I feel a bit like Parkinson. Anyway, the book is called Sick Money: The Truth About the Global Pharmaceutical Industry. So thanks very much, Billy.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so I thought I'll obviously focus largely on liothyronine, and I'm going to talk through what it is that happened to that drug, how it was possible, and obviously, as many of you are very familiar with the consequences, both for the NHS and for patients of that, and then talk a bit as well about what the price hiking of liothyronine and many other drugs at around the same time tells us about the pharmaceutical industry, and particularly about how the industry has changed over the last 4 or 5 decades or so. And those sort of twin strands are the focus of my book, as Mark mentioned. It looks like this. It's called Sick Money. And so so just to start with a bit of background, I'm an investigative journalist at the Times, and that means I cover quite a wide variety of topics, but I'm basically given more time to really dig into them and to try and uncover new pieces of information, things that maybe people or companies don't want the public to find out about. And back in early 2016 or so, and maybe it was late 2015 perhaps, I decided to start looking into the pharmaceutical industry and particularly into the price of medicines. There had been sporadic stories, particularly in Europe and in the US, of patient groups and health services complaining about medicines going up in price. And I wanted to see what was going on here. Obviously, the UK system is very different to a lot of countries in having a national health service that pays for prescriptions and therefore a single buyer. But I wanted to see what was going on. And to cut that part of the story slightly short, because it basically involved getting hold of and going through a very large number of documents. What I found was that the price of some medicines was going up and going up really dramatically by, in some cases, thousands of % in the space of a few months. And what was puzzling is that this wasn't new medicines. These weren't medicines that had just been developed, but these were old medicines, often very old medicines dating back several decades. And they were going up in price, as I say, in a very short period of time. And that's not really how the pharmaceutical industry, even in my, at that point, fairly primitive understanding, is supposed to work. There are broadly two types of medicines. There are newly invented, newly discovered medicines, which tend to be expensive. The company making them will have a patent, which means no one else can make it for a period of 20 years. And the price of those medicines is expected to be relatively high in order to allow the company to recoup the money it invested in developing that drug and perhaps in other drugs that didn't work, and to make a profit. And then when that period of patent protection ends, then anyone is allowed to make the drug. Anyone is allowed to apply for a license to make the drug, and they become known as generics. And most of the common drugs that we all know and that many people take are generic medicines. They're made by lots of companies. They compete with one another on price, and so these medicines are typically very cheap. I mean, often pennies, particularly for medicines that date back many decades. So what was going on here, what I could see in the data, didn't really make sense, because you had these drugs that in theory lots of companies could make. There were no patents, those were long expired, they were straightforward to make. People had been making them for many years, but they were going up in price. And as I say, they were going up in price very dramatically. And I guess I had lots of questions at this stage. I wanted to know how this was possible, especially in a system as in the UK, where you have one single dominant buyer. Why was the NHS allowing this to happen? Why was it paying these prices? Why weren't other companies coming in and undercutting these inflated prices and taking a share of the market? What is it that was going on, and why did no one seem to be doing anything about it? A lot of these price rises had been going on for several years and were costing the NHS, I could see, very large sums of money, millions of pounds a month per drug. And this seemed to be happening to a large number of drugs. So to focus on liothyronine, which was one of the drugs with the largest increase in percentage terms, liothyronine dates back to the 1950s. It was originally discovered by GlaxoSmithKline, the very well-known large pharmaceutical company, and it was sold under a brand name called Tetroxin. Over the years, Glaxo had divested the drug. They'd sold it off, the license for it off to another company, and were no longer making it. And by 2007, when it was very cheaply available, I think it was about £4 for a packet of 28 tablets, it was only being made in the UK by one company, which was a company called Gold Shield, which some of you may have may ring a vague bell, because in the early 2000s they were at the centre of a big price fixing investigation by the Serious Fraud Office, which ultimately didn't result in any charges in their case, but led to that company being rebranded as Mercury Pharmaceuticals. So it was known as Mercury Pharmaceuticals when in 2007 the executives at this company hit upon a means of increasing the price. This drug that had been £4 a tablet, £4 a packet, started to rise in price. And what I discovered is that they had discovered essentially a loophole in the way that the NHS pays for medicines and controls the price of medicines. So it goes back again to that split between new medicines and older medicines. So the NHS requires nowadays that new medicines go through a cost effectiveness test through a body called NICE. And then after that, we'll often negotiate further over the price of those new medicines. And their price will then be agreed at the launch, and the company will then have very limited ability to change the price after that point, certainly in terms of an increase. So those medicines are controlled by negotiations and then by price controls once they've been launched onto the market. Older medicines are treated very differently by the NHS because they are supposed to be cheap and they're supposed to be being made by lots of companies. The NHS basically relies on market forces to set the price of those drugs and to keep the price of those drugs down. And what that meant was, if you had a drug that was sold under a brand name, as Lyothyron was at this point, as Tetroxin, and you dropped the brand name and relaunched it as what's known as an unbranded generic, so you're just selling it under its scientific name, then you're no longer subject to the price controls that exist for branded medicines. And at that point, it's just down to market forces. And what Mercury realized was that as the sole supplier in the UK of this medicine, market forces meant they essentially had pricing freedom. They could set whatever price they wanted, and the NHS would pay it. The NHS would reimburse pharmacists for dispensing it at the set amount that was linked to that price. So that's duly what happened. And as the price started to rise, it was more than £20 a packet by early 2009. And then a private equity company called HG Capital, which is based in London, became interested in what was happening at Mercury and funded a management buyout. And then the price continued to rise further. It had reached nearly £46 a packet. This is up from £4 by the time in 2012 that HG Capital sold the company on to a different private equity company. This one is called Cinven. CINVEN. They're also based in London, and what they did is they acquired Mercury and a second pharmaceutical company, a company called Andipharm, and decided that they were going to price hike a whole bunch of drugs across those two companies. And under their watch, the price of this drug rose to nearly £190. Now you might be thinking, why is it that no one else is making this drug? I said that generics have no restrictions in terms of intellectual property or patent rights. Why were no other generic manufacturers coming into the market? The short answer is that they were likely to at some point, but it takes 2 or 3 years to obtain a license from the regulator, which is required in the UK. In order to sell a medicine, you have to prove that your product is the same as the drug that's already on the market. You have to provide things like stability data that show it how it will last on the shelf, and you have to pay quite a sum of money, several £100,000, to obtain this license. And all of that is a risk. And at this point, certainly at the start of these price rises, Lyothyron wasn't a very interesting drug for any other companies. It wasn't making that much money relative to most medicines. It was quite a small, albeit quite a stable patient group. And there wasn't a financial incentive to do so. That changed as the price rose, but again, because of the time it takes to obtain a license, the company involved, Mercury Pharma, in doing this, knew that it had a window in which it would be the only supplier. And I think the fact that window may have been time limited if someone else did apply for a license probably explains why the price rose as quickly as it did. What we've also seen, not in Lyotharin's case, but in other cases, of drugs that were price hiked and debranded and then price hiked in this way, is that companies made secret deals. One company would say to another, I'm about to launch another version of your product that you've driven up in price and you're making huge profits off. How about you pay me 30% of those profits and I won't launch my version? And so that also happened with a number of drugs. And then the other factor that restricted people coming into this market was manufacturing difficulties. Lyothyron is viewed as quite a difficult drug, relatively speaking, to manufacture, and so you have to find a specialist manufacturer with the capabilities of doing that, and all of that is time consuming and expensive as well. So in 2012, Cinven buys Mercury, and and at this point, the price is £46 a packet. It's going to go up under their watch to nearly £190. And one of the things that's emerged that I think it would be quite interesting to show you, so I'm going to attempt to screen share now, is some of the internal presentations, documents, and emails that were exchanged inside this company, Cinven, that bought Mercury, and also among Mercury executives as they were merged to create this new company, which was called Amco. I won't expect you to follow all the names of these companies, but I mention them in case they're familiar, they ring any bells, they've come up at all in anything you've read on what happened to Lyothyron. And what those emails and other documents show us is that there was this was a deliberate strategy. This was that Cinven bought Amdipharm, intending to apply Mercury's strategy of debranding and price hiking to the various old medicines that Amdipharm owned whenever they were the only supplier, or even if there was only a very small number of suppliers, because it would still be worth their while in that case. And in fact, what often happens when there's only 2 or 3 suppliers and one supplier raises the prices, that the others follow suit. That's something that we've seen in the US with insulin. It's part of the reason that insulin has become so unaffordably expensive. It was that the only companies that were making it were matching each other's price rises and not competing on price. But we can see from this is an extract from the minutes of an investment committee meeting that was held at Cinven in 2012, when they were deciding whether or not to buy Mercury and ultimately this other company alongside them. They reported in this recommendation to make the investment that Mercury operates below the radar and capitalizes on opportunities to achieve volume and pricing growth even in such a heavily regulated market. Reimbursement for drug manufacturers is controlled by a small group within the Department of Health, I mean a small number of officials. The focus is on high volume drugs, patent and off patent, as this is where the absolute quantum of savings is higher. Niche products are typically below the radar. So they thought, and I think this is accurate, that with a limited number of resources at the Department of Health, that they would be focused only on the newer medicines, the very expensive medicines that required huge amounts of healthcare spending, and wouldn't be paying attention to these drugs that were under the radar, that at one point were only, Lyothyron in 2007 was only costing the NHS £600,000 a year. And as the price rose, that went up. It would reach a peak of £30 million a year for approximately the same number of prescriptions as when it had cost £600,000 a year. But even then, it didn't seem to be catching the attention of this limited resourced section of the health department. And I'll now share my screen to show you a couple of the slides. The first document is the notes, speaking notes made by Amco, or Mercury. It later became known as Advance. It had lots of different names. Its chief executive is a guy called John Baton in 2012. This is just after Cinven have invested. And here you can see he's setting out why they believe this strategy will be so effective. It talks about the focus of a Department of Health with limited resources being on patent drugs. These are the newer medicines I've talked about, and how on an individual drug basis, this is down at the bottom, where there is no or limited competition, it allows drug producers to increase prices and margin. This is the key element for Mercury with its niche portfolio. And if I then move on to an extract of the actual presentation that was given, you can see that they talk specifically about how the management actively identifies branded products where the company has exclusive or semi-exclusive positions and deliberately debrands them, thus freeing the product from the PPRS pricing regime. And that PPRS pricing regime is the regime I mentioned of pricing controls that applies to branded medicines. Because the company has exclusive or semi-exclusive positions, there is no or limited competition for its products. This slide shows you, this is a slide from a presentation, as it says down the bottom, that was given in 2014. And this is Advance, Amco as it was known at that point, boasting about its success specifically with Lyothyron and how they've managed to take these chunky annual price increases, and that there'd been no pushback and no impact on prescriptions, that they've managed to therefore grow the value of the product. And if you could if you're looking at that graph, if you remember that starts in 2010, but back in 2007, the product had been much cheaper again at £4. And if you could draw that graph on into the future at that point, into 2015 and ultimately into 2016, it reached a peak of nearly £250 a packet. That's the price that the NHS is paying to reimburse pharmacists for dispensing it. So a huge increase in the price of this drug, and one that the company was very happy with. They were boasting about being able to do this year after year, with, as it says there, more increases planned for the following year. A very successful, from their perspective, commercial strategy. This strategy, which they called a price optimization strategy, wasn't just applied to liothyronine. It was applied to a number of drugs, and across this company and several others that followed a similar strategy. Dozens of drugs, I think ultimately more than 70 drugs had big price increases, often through this debranding mechanism. And of course, it had consequences for the NHS, as I've mentioned. The price, the spend each year went up from £600,000 to £30 million a year. But it also had, in liothyronina's case, some really quite significant consequences for patients. And it's worth saying that liothyronine is quite unusual in this respect. There are, as I say, lots of drugs that have had big price increases. I'm not aware of any other drug where it led to the NHS, in some NHS bodies, reviewing whether it should be recommended for prescribing because it no longer represented good value for money, and therefore punishing effectively patients for the profiteering that these companies had done. So it was in 2014, at a point when the price was £95 a packet, that an NHS body first identified liothyronine as representing, or as I should say, as by that point representing what it believed was poor value for money. And in 2015, it was added by a different body to something called the drop list, which is a list of medicines that it believes are not cost effective, represent poor value because of this price increase. And that carried on. We can get perhaps into more detail on this in the question and answer session later. But by 2017, there was national guidance which discouraged the prescribing and dispensing of liothyronine. And although this was clarified a couple of years later with regional guidance that made it clear that patients shouldn't be taken off it if it was clinically effective, and that was the recommendation of their consultant, it nevertheless is clear that in lots of parts of the country, doctors did take people off liothyronine because of this pressure from their CCGs, because of this price increase. And as a consequence, either had to do without the medicine, to buy it online. I've spoken to people who have bought it through websites that are, as we put it, it's dubious to say the least, that are aimed at people looking to get hold of steroid supplements and all sorts of things for weightlifting, but also found a market for patients that were desperate for T3, or certainly before the pandemic, to go abroad, because this was a drug that remains and has remained very cheaply available in large parts of Europe, particularly countries like France and Greece, where it's only a few euros a packet, even as it costs the NHS £250 a packet here. And we can get into why the NHS couldn't just go and buy it from abroad. But that's sort of summary of what happened to liothyronine and how this debranding price optimization strategy that a few pharmaceutical companies hit upon, and which particularly I think private equity supercharged by viewing it as a way of driving rapid growth. If they could buy these companies and apply it to a wider range of products, that's an explanation of why liothyronine went up in price so much, and remains greatly inflated compared to where it was at the start of that whole process at £4 a packet. I started writing about these price hikes, liothyronine and other drugs. As I say, there were about 70 in total in 2016. And one of the great privileges of being a journalist and of having a story on the front page is that it can have real impact. And it was read in Westminster and Whitehall, and as a result, there were a number of referrals to the Competition and Markets Authority, which is the competition regulator, which investigated several companies in relation to liothyronine, amongst other investigations. And also the government tabled and eventually passed legislation, the Health Service Medical Supplies Costs Act in 2017, which gives them the power to intervene in these cases. So if the health secretary believes that a price is excessive, they previously believed they were hamstrung because of a slightly complicated situation where if a company was a member of one scheme in relation to branded medicines, the government believed that prevented it from intervening in other parts of its portfolio in its unbranded medicines. But those powers have not yet been used, although the competition watchdog has now produced results, as was mentioned. Last July, a fine of £100 million, just over £100 million, was handed down to what is now called Advance and some of its former owners, and some other fines were handed down as well. One of the biggest was a £260 million fine over a drug called hydrocortisone, which had gone up by an even larger amount. Those fines are all being appealed, so we wait to see whether that is successful. But if it isn't, it will then be open to the Department of Health and the NHS to take civil action to reclaim the extra money it's spent on liothyronine and these other drugs. So that is potentially another 100 million that could go back to the health service. Of course, well, I should say, so because of that price hike, the other thing that happened is that it did become a more appealing market to other companies, and eventually, I think at least 2 other companies, it may now be more, obtained licenses, Morningside and Teva, to produce their own versions of liothyronine tablets. And strangely, that didn't lead to significant falls in the price immediately. They were happy to follow the price that by that point had been set. But we have now gradually seen a decline and a fall in the price. I think it was still at about £140 a year ago. It was £70 last month, and I think it's come down to £63 or something thereabouts this month. And those figures, or rather next month, those figures are from something called the Nhs Drug Tariff, which is a list essentially of the reimbursement prices that the NHS will pay pharmacists for their medicines. So that's the sort of price hiking scandal, if you like, and what happened to a large number of medicines. This happened in the UK. That was particularly my focus, but similar things have happened in other countries, in Europe, and also in the United States. You may recall Martin Shkreli, a man called Martin Shkreli, who increased the price of an AIDS medication in the US from $17.50 to $750 overnight, and caused an outcry in the process there. I think these pricing abuses are sort of shocking in their own right, but I think they also have something to say about the state of the pharmaceutical industry and some of the things that have gone wrong, and some of the changes that have occurred with that industry. And this is some of the broader topics that I explore in the book, alongside this story of price hiking. They are not just isolated cases of bad actors. They are symptoms of an industry that has become very focused on treating medicines as financial assets. There's a whole story as to why these medicines were available to companies like Mercury, why the big pharmaceutical companies didn't want them anymore. It's to do with the focus they now have on the biggest billion-dollar blockbusters to the exclusion of anything else. They were attractive to investors. Some of these companies did very well on stock markets in other countries because they had a compelling story to tell about how they could make quick profits without having to do any of the complicated and risky investment in research and development into new medicines, which was proving to be expensive and decreasing in productivity at this time. There was a big issue for the industry as a whole with the rate of return from drug discovery. And it's a consequence too of a sort of shift in mindset, really, which the book traces dating back to the 1980s, when pricing executives pricing sort of gurus began to argue to executives that they were underpricing their products significantly, and that if you've got a product which will save somebody's life or transform somebody's life, that has an almost infinite value to that person, and therefore you can price it much more aggressively. So we've seen much more aggressive pricing across all sorts of areas, from cancer drugs to treatments for rare diseases. We see big increases in the cost of medicines each year in countries like the US, which are key markets. And all of that has chipped away at the balance that had long existed, the sort of social contract between the industry and society, in which we have this situation where we will agree to pay to grant patents and pay higher prices during a defined period, and then we'll have cheaper medicines afterwards. We've seen with these price hikes how the cheaper medicines afterwards bit of the equation can go wrong. The first bit has gone wrong as well, with companies finding very diverse and creative ways to extend their patent period artificially with all sorts of tricks and techniques. So there's lots of stories of corporate misbehavior and dirty tricks and all sorts of malfeasance, but there are also in the book stories of a lot of patients and patient groups and people that have been able to fight back even with these huge imbalances of power. So I can get into more of that side of thing and the effect that this cultural shift and scientific challenges have had on not just prices, but the types of medicines we get and the types of medicines that don't get developed anymore. But perhaps if I hand over to you, Mark, for Lorraine's update, and then we can launch into some questions.
Thank you ever so much, but it was very clear. And just someone's made the point, actually, it would be really nice to have those slides added at the end of the presentation for everyone, just to, because they would be quite useful for people, particularly if they're arguing their case with their GP or MP, whoever's running their care these days. So Lorraine, you're going to move to talk about MPs. You're going to tell us about your experience at the House of Lords recently. Do you want to just explain the background and what you did and who you spoke to?
Yeah, sure. So as most of you probably know, Thyroid Trust is still quite a new little charity, and we sort of came into being midway through this hideous saga of the situation with liothyronine that Billy's been explaining and giving the wider context to. One of the first things that we did was we got wind in 2018 that there was going to be a debate in the House of Lords, and we put quite a lot of time and energy into producing a very detailed briefing note for parliamentarians, which I think was very useful because it meant that the parliamentarians in that debate really understood the impact on patients of the price increases. Lyothyronine, who's ever heard of it unless they happen to be a thyroid patient who doesn't respond well to levothyroxine and is having an awful time as a result. So we really sort of explained it and gave sort of patient examples and things. And as a result, the debate went very much in favour of patients, and the then health minister asked us to produce with our partners, because we work with all of the other thyroid patient groups as well, and the professional body for thyroid specialists, British Thyroid Association. They asked us to work together and produce a report that basically sort of showed where the national guidance, which they thought was perfectly clear and should allow patients who need liothyronine to be prescribed on the NHS, they said, well, where are patients not being given it? So we worked very hard for many months with our partners, and we produced a huge big document which was called the Lyotharnin Dossier, which some of you may have read and some of you may have contributed to, either in helping with the production of the document, as Tara and Helga and Kath, who are here on the call, and Judith all did, or you might have submitted your story. There was lots and lots of patient stories, and also a survey of all of the different local policy documents that exist across the NHS, and we discovered that around about half of them were basically still trying very, very hard not to allow patients to have liothyronine because of the cost, because the guidance was unclear. As a result of that dossier, the Regional Medicines Optimisation Committee, as Mark and Billy both mentioned, issued updated and clearer guidance, which it still kind of discouraged prescribing, but it did say very clearly, this was in, when was that, July 2019. It did say very clearly that if patients don't get on with levothyroxine and a specialist says that they should have liothyronine and they've been proven to do okay on liothyronine, then they should have it on the NHS. And that's been really, really clearly stated since that guideline in 2019. And we practically sat on NHS England and the people who were producing that guideline, really sort of pushing them on sort of a lot of the details in it to make sure that it was really, really crystal clear and said what patients needed it to say. But lo and behold, the situation has continued, that some CCGs have got a bit better, some have seemed to have got more intransigent. You've got this very, very fragmented system in the UK where, although you've got national guidelines, which are, explaining good practice, local areas are controlled by people who are very concerned about budgets and maybe don't sort of understand the finer points of treating hypothyroidism. So there's still lots and lots of patients who are being denied treatment. We attended a conference with the specialists from America, Europe and Britain in December 2019, I think it was, no, May, oh, hang on, I'm losing my dates here. The end of 2019. And we and other patient representatives who were there basically sort of told the doctors there what patients felt about liothyronine. And as a result, in May 2021, the American Thyroid Association, European Thyroid Association, and British Thyroid Association jointly published a consensus document saying, what the new approach to research should be to prove the clinical benefit of liothyronine. Because if you're a specialist in this field, or if you're a patient who's benefited from it, then you know that it is transformational for some people. But because it's such an old drug, the science isn't really sort of solid enough to make a really, really strong case. So hopefully there's going to be some new research taking place. And we know that, for example, in the Netherlands at the moment, there is a large-scale clinical trial going on with T3, which we hope will render some good results. We've been pushing really hard on getting lots of publicity for the cause, and we've produced a couple of update reports to the Lyotharnin Dossier, which basically keep making the same point. Around about half of clinical commissioning groups are not supporting patients' needs and making it really, really difficult for some patients to get this treatment, are causing some patients still to have to do crazy things like travel to Greece to buy their medicine, or go online and buy their medicine, or if they've got the money, to go and see a private consultant. Of course, not everyone can afford to do that. So it's really, really important that we keep trying to shine a light on this issue. We had a meeting as a result of our follow-up report with NHS England in February 2020, and they promised faithfully, looking at the results of that report, that they would then write to all the clinical commissioning groups and remind them of their obligation to take into consideration the national guidance. And guess what? Then there was a major pandemic. So we didn't actually hear from them until December of that year, when they said, we're really sorry, there's been a pandemic, we will still do it, but we haven't done it yet. So we chased them up, and we finally heard from them in July last year, when they again said, oh yes, we will, but we haven't yet heard whether they actually have or not. So we've got some fantastic champions who are on our side, and one of those is Lord Hunt, who's a Labour peer in the House of Lords, and he put down an amendment on the Health and Care Bill on January 26th, which was supported by another of our fabulous champions, Lord Borwick, who's a Tory peer and actually our patron, who's thyroid eye disease himself. And the two of them made really, really compelling speeches in the House of Lords on January the 26th, again emphasising the importance of liothyronine for those patients who need it, and the fact that it's still really, really difficult for some patients to get it. The whole issue of the price is something that the NHS procurement team have to sort out. As patients, we're pushing for guidance to be clear and for CCGs to comply with it. As a result of that meeting on January the 26th, the Health Minister, Lord Kamal, very kindly invited us and also Lynn Minot of Thyroid UK to join a meeting with him and representatives from the Department of Health and Lord Borwick and Lord Hunt, where we further explained the issue. And they're now talking to NICE and hoping that the NICE reference to the prescribing guidance for liothyronine is going to be made clearer, which will be really helpful. And they're also looking at what they can do with CCGs. They can't force them to follow local guidance, but they do have an obligation to put patient needs first and to give due consideration to national guidance. So we just keep pushing. I don't really know what else we can do. We've been collating reports from patients. We're on the verge of being able to publish another report, which Helga has led on the research of, looking again at what the current position is with CCGs, and it's still really as bad as it's ever been, if not worse. We've also got lots and lots of reports from individuals of experiences that they're having with doctors around the country. So, you know, we've had people going to see NHS specialists who've said, yes, you need liothyronine, but you're going to have to go to Greece to buy it, which is just crazy. And I think if we put all of this into a report, then, you know, hopefully it's just a little bit more pressure on the powers that be to stop this ridiculous situation. So yeah, thank you all very much for supporting us by coming today and being part of the discussion. If any of you've got any, you know, expertise or other ways that you can help us, then, you know, let us know, because we need to keep pushing this.
Okay, thank you very much, Lorraine. That was very, very clear and very helpful. We've got a few questions, Billy, on the chat. If I just sort of, they're in a sort of a fairly structured order, but I'll just go through a couple of them because there's a couple of themes. And one of this issue is the cost, and you mentioned how difficult it was to make in terms of it being a difficult molecule apparently but there does seem to be quite a wide discrepancy in the cost in different countries in Europe. Do you have any feel for why it is so cheap in Turkey or Greece, and what is it, a different manufacturing standard? Do you know what's in your 20 micrograms and your tablet is your 20 micrograms? Has anyone looked at the different preparations and what you can get abroad?
So when I said it's sort of thought to be relatively difficult to manufacture, it's not so much that it's expensive to manufacture. It's more that relative to other generics, it requires a degree more complexity, and so you need a slightly more specialized manufacturer to do it. A lot of these companies use contract manufacturers. They don't make them directly themselves. I think the difference in pricing in different European countries is really down to regulation. It's not down to different costs of manufacturing. It's just down to what the different ways in which different countries regulate prices, and with a different regime, and certainly with more manufacturers, there's no reason liothyronine shouldn't be sold in the UK for a price very similar to what it is available for in somewhere like France. I mean, that is, you know, that was the price 15 years ago.
Okay, so yeah, so Mary S. raised that question. And then on that, and Helga's just raised the point about this NHS procurement process and who actually makes that decision, because it seems a fairly sort of murky body that's making all these decisions. Do you actually sort of have an idea who's chairing these committees and who actually comes up with these sort of various rulings on how much they're prepared to pay, for example?
So reimbursement prices are set in defined ways for several different categories of drug, and the category you're in depends on whether you're a branded drug or not, and also how commonly prescribed it is. So there are two categories for unbranded drugs, but basically for liothyronine, it's now based on actual sales figures. So looking back retrospectively. So that's just market forces. In terms of who decides which versions of the drug can be used in the UK, it's down to companies to apply for a license from the MHRA, and you can't sell a prescription drug in the UK without a license. There's a small category of exemptions which is parallel import, where pharmacists and wholesalers can import with a parallel import license something which is the same drug and which has a European license, but that's become more complicated with Brexit, and was always a relatively small percentage of the market. What often happens, not in this case, but with a drug where one company is making it in lots of different countries and can command higher prices in some countries than others because of pricing regimes, is that they very tightly control the number of units that they will allocate to each country, so that there isn't a lot spare in the system for somebody to buy up in Spain, say, because it's cheap there, and sell it in the Netherlands because it's more expensive there. So companies have ways to try and minimise that parallel import sort of.
The point I suppose people think is that we're being charged the 60 quid a month, and it's sort of £1. It's just, in any other market force that does seem a rather extreme differential compared to, but I take your point. Jim
I mean,
Harwood,
I agree, basically. It is an extreme differential, and it doesn't need to be the case.
Yeah, so I suppose we were just sort of thinking, who is actually that person? I mean, do you know who is? I mean, are these pharmacists? I mean, are these? Is it a government committee, or who is deciding that point?
The body that oversees the drug tariff is the NHS BSA, which is, I think, the Business Services Authority. But that's really an administrative role. They'll collect information on pricing according to these different rules about how categories are priced, and do the calculation and produce a new figure each month. There isn't anyone in the NHS that's saying, yes, we'll pay £60 instead of £5, because procurement isn't handled centrally in that way, in terms of from buying it from a specific manufacturer. The NHS sets a reimbursement price according to its rules, and then simply we'll hand that price over to pharmacists after they've dispensed a packet of the drug. And that's why you can get these anomalies, and why these anomalies can really last for years if the NHS or the Department of Health aren't paying attention, because it's all sort of automatic that they will pay these reimbursement prices.
And that's why all the awareness raising is so important, because if you can make a lot of noise about something, then you can influence them actually paying a little bit more attention. I know when the prices were going up under Concordia, when they were the sole license holder, they said to us that each time they increased the price, they did actually tell the NHS that they were going to do it in advance, and I think they were quite surprised when nobody in the NHS said no, nobody told them that was unreasonable. They just let the increases go through, because it's such a dynamic market.
That was them telling this body, the NHS BSA, and this happened with a number of different drugs. I think the view of people at the NHS BSA was that it's not their role to regulate prices. They're just recording what people are telling them. So there were certainly the cases with even larger increases than this, where they would receive emails and they'd just wave them through. It seemed to be my impression of that is it was a breakdown in kind of communication or role more than anything. But often even doctors prescribing these drugs regularly don't realise they've gone up in price significantly, and can be only with a private prescription when you see the actual price.
So once you got through that hurdle, Billy, then I mean the next stage is at the CCG level, where they seem to be fairly autonomous. I.e., I don't know how many there are. There are about 60. I mean, do you know how many CCGs there are in England and Wales? Is it?
I think they had a reshuffle, didn't they, not that long ago? And I would say maybe about 100 now, but maybe it's a bit less than that.
So, I mean, it seems that each of these individual CCGs are making their own decision. They've all got their own budget, and they basically allocate it, and they choose things they don't have to or want to spend it on. Is that what your understanding is? So this 50-50 split, and why some are so
Yes, exactly. So CCGs are the bodies that actually have a budget for medicines in that area and pay over the money, these reimbursement prices to pharmacists. So they do have some leeway in terms of deeming something to be cost effective and encouraging people, or not cost effective, and encouraging doctors not to prescribe that. But they are required to fund anything that is on the drug tariff and is prescribed.
I mean, my feeling is that 100% there would never have been any liothyronine discussion if it had been 5p a month. It's completely, So, I mean, when we think a lot of things we do in medicine aren't, I mean, I was just looking back, actually reminding myself, I was involved in some European Thyroid Association guidelines in 2012. And even then, liothyronine was seen as fairly experimental. And the European group was sort of just saying, look, it is experimental. Here are some basic rules to follow. And then the British Thyroid Association did some more formal guidelines in 2016, but it was based on very little good quality evidence. So as someone at the other side, if you are a neutral pharmacist looking at the evidence, it was always a difficult argument, because you didn't have the rigorous data for what was then being deemed as a very expensive medicine. And that's always been a problem. In terms of, I mean, obviously individuals are in all these different CCGs, and some of them are on the call. What is the best approach? I mean, I usually tell people to go through their GP first, appeal through their GP. It is quite a complicated and particularly in the pandemic where you can't get near a GP very easily at the moment physically. How do you what's your advice in terms of how people are navigating the appeal process when, then I know there's a couple of comments here about people who might be moving house to a different area and worried they'll lose their prescription, etc., which I know is a real issue for some of my patients as well. How do people navigate and go through this CCG appeal process?
Billy, before you answer that, can I just jump in, Mark? I just spotted something in the chat that I thought it might be worth you addressing. You mentioned that specialists have seen T3 as a bit of a sort of experimental approach, and Judy in the chat says that we don't see it as experimental. It's been around for decades, and I wondered if you maybe could just explain what you mean when you describe it as experimental, because I think I know what you mean, but I think it's maybe confused people.
Yeah, well, I'm
using
sort of
that term.
Yeah, I was funny. I was just reading. This is the European Thyroid Association guidelines in 2012, and
it uses that word, doesn't it?
Yeah, and so levothyroxine, liothyronine combination therapy should be considered solely as an experimental treatment modality. The present guidelines are offered to enhance its safety and counter its indiscriminate use. So I'm just giving you some background that's what was and that was a European body with Dutch, Greek, Norwegian, British, and I think Russian. I suppose we still had the Russians on board then. So that was quite a wide European consensus view. So it wasn't just a narrow UK NHS view. So I'm just giving you a bit of a flavour of the evidence of the time. So
but did that mean sort of experiment with an individual patient and see if it works for them, or did it mean only use it in scientific experiments?
So the whole thrust of that document was then sort of just going into this individualized experiment. So it was quite clear that the studies available just weren't strong enough to show the benefit. So although they were sort of coming out with not much extra benefit, if at all. And, in medicine, if you are offering somebody an experiment, a drug that's that expensive, it does need to be quite carefully justified in a tough health economic climate. But the point I'm making, it wasn't just a UK issue. I mean, that was a European consensus document agreed by the European Thyroid Association, and they've been using liothyronine for many years. So the thrust of the document was safety first, but to individualize care and to trial.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then that's how this sort of pathway started, just saying, look, here is the option, here is how you do it safely. In 3 months, you know the answer. You either give up or you continue. And that's sort of how it sort of went about. But even that was even in countries where it was 5p a tablet. So what I'm saying is it wasn't cost. The experimental issue was not about cost. It was all about the evidence that we had at the time. Yeah. Sorry, Billy, I forgot what I'd asked you.
Sorry, Billy.
It was about how to handle your CCGs, I think.
Yeah, because I think, because once you've got through this trial hurdle, you are a bit of an N=1. So, if you think, it's a 2 or 3% of the population are on thyroid hormone replacement. So, each GP practice will have several hundred people on thyroxine, but probably relatively few, needing so in each individual GP, they won't be coming up. I get so much feedback saying the GP just doesn't know what I'm talking about because they just don't have, that level of experience. So they just don't have the number of patients. They might have 1 or 2 at most on their books. So how do they, what do people do to go through that appeal process?
So correct me if I'm wrong, Lorraine, but I think the key thing from the guidance as it currently stands, certainly from the 2019 guidance, is that new patients who want to go on liothyronine, it has to be initiated by the consultant.
Yeah.
And so I think the key is to get in front of a consultant and
get in front of a consultant that is sympathetic to using T3, because as Mark says, it's long been regarded by specialist professional bodies as a medicine that doesn't have a really solid amount of evidence backing up the effectiveness. So those doctors who are willing to prescribe it, they have to be open to working with the patient on an individual case-by-case basis to see if it helps them. And some of them are very against it because they're very concerned about potential risks. Some of them are much more relaxed about it. So it's worth making sure that you get referred to somebody that you can be sure of a sympathetic hearing from. And then if you do have a CCG, which is trying to say that whatever the endocrinologist prescribes you can't have, or if you have a GP who says they don't want to follow the endocrinologist guidance, just refer them to the guideline, because it's very clear. It recognises that if this treatment helps you and you weren't helped by levothyroxine, and a specialist is supporting your case, then you should have it on the NHS. You shouldn't be having to go private, you shouldn't be having to go abroad. And there's lots of resources on our website, standard letters and links to all the guidance and everything that you can use to make your case. It's just really unfortunate that those patients who are able to either get or keep their liothyronine prescription tends to be the most articulate, the most assertive. It shouldn't be that way. Access should be equal for everybody.
Anything you want to add to that, Billy? Are you happy with that?
No, certainly. Yeah, certainly agree with all of that. It does, and it does unfortunately just seem to be a lot down to the area and the individual consultants at the moment. And
I mean, that's always. I mean, I know colleagues who just don't. I mean, you have to accept that there is an expert opinion group here who simply don't think liothyronine is appropriate. So it's quite difficult even with a narrow specialty like us to get a complete consensus from everybody. So, and I have sort of. When anyone says, "Oh, I'll get referred to," I mean, you've got no chance at the moment of seeing your preferred endocrinologist. I mean, you get referred to a department. So the chances of you actually coming, up with someone, in that, ideal historical scenario is actually much more difficult these days than it ever has been before.
Yeah.
As somebody, I think Nat F just was saying on that issue. I mean, I think there's a lot of theoretical risks about liothyronine, but they're all pretty minimal in my experience. And the 3-month trial decides who can tolerate it and who can't. And actually, there are some reasonable studies now in terms of big populations that say it doesn't seem to offer any particular disadvantage to conventional levothyroxine. So I think, although the hazards of liothyronine are often quoted by people who don't want to prescribe it, it's not as great as has been reported. So I think that comes back to this individual trial. And I think the other thing I tend to do as well is just make sure that that the patient has agreed with me that they've had the risks discussed with them. You put it in the GP letter, so everyone's I think there's this thing, oh, you're going to be sued type thing if something goes wrong. But if it's all open and above board, then even all the theoretical risks can be put in a clinic letter that the patient has signed up to. So I think that's the way to get around this.
Just to add to that as well, Mark, Tara's just reminded me that we ought to mention, in terms of patients who are facing difficulties, they might refer their healthcare providers to the Norfolk and Waveney prescribing pathway or patient pathway for liothyronine, which basically documents a lot of that good practice that you were just talking about, and sort of makes it much clearer for clinicians who maybe feel less confident, a good practice pathway that they can follow. And at the moment, Norfolk and Waveney CCG is the only one in the country that's actually approved a patient pathway. But we showed this to Lord Kamal at the meeting, and they're going to see about getting that more widely adopted, which would be really good. And just like to say huge kudos to Tara and also Tracy Buckingham of the Norfolk Thyroid Patient Support Group, who worked so hard with their CCG for literally 3 years to get that document approved and to get it to say the things that patients need it to say. So it's really good work, guys.
As someone who's been scarred from working in the NHS, if only it was that easy that they would just take someone else's and use it. They all want to create their own, I'm afraid. So it's very, very difficult. And
it's really hard work.
That is far too sensible. June, Hislop, so some CGs are still blacklisting liothyronine, and endocrinologists won't prescribe it, even if you demonstrated a near need for it, which is contrary to updated guidance. So this is sort of what we've been discussing a little bit. And I think I suspect it may be of value to try and use the Thyroid Trust a little bit, really, to sort of get on your side. And I would just be seeking, I don't know what you think, Lorraine, I presume patients coming to you all the time, are they, to get help in how to manage
we do, and we're so little that, you know, we don't have a great amount of resource, unfortunately, to support individual patients, which I hope in the fullness of time we'll get to a stage where we've got the resource to get more involved with individual patients. We have with some people, and it has been effective. But yeah, we really need to grow. I mean, the British Thyroid Foundation have a telephone support line. They've got a number of volunteers that people can ring. There's various forums out there that people can connect with other patients. But I would really just sort of sound a note of caution that if you're looking for information online, stick to reliable sources. If you want to show information to your doctor about T3, the possible efficacy of T3, you know, take information from our website or from the British Thyroid Foundation website. You know, be really, really careful about quoting information from somewhere that, you know, it isn't an approved source of information. And yeah, please send us your reports of T3, and as and when we've got more resource and we're able to help individual patients, then you know, I certainly hope that we'll be in a position to do that. We want to hear people's stories, because then we can amplify them upwards and help bring about change at a national level.
So just Michael Bond has just raised something, Billy, just to clarify why the Health Services Cost Act has not been utilised to date. Do you just mind explaining that?
It's a good question. So I think part of the problem was that it was passed under with Jeremy Hunt as Health Secretary, and then there was a reshuffle not very long after, I think a couple of months after, and then we had a new Health Secretary, and it wasn't his baby, as it were. I think broadly the strategy was to leave things, certainly with these cases, to let the Competition and Markets Authority investigations run their course, and then to potentially take civil action to recoup the funds, but to do things in that order. And that their hope is that these powers will be there as a, you know, as a warning to other companies not to do something similar in future, but as a, you know, preventative rather than necessarily having to use them. But given that there are quite a number of drugs that went up in price hugely that still haven't come, in some cases, back down so very much at all, and certainly drugs like liothyronine not down by as much as you might want. It is a good question why they, you know, why pass this legislation and then not use it for what has now been 5 years. It is, you know, politics, I think, is the short answer.
We had some insight on that when we spoke with sort of senior people within the NHS and who had previously worked at high level in the NHS, who said that they thought perhaps the reason that the Act hadn't been implemented yet is that as soon as government tried to interfere with pricing of drugs, they would be hit with a really hefty lawsuit from the drugs companies. And so it potentially would be counterproductive. But I think they were waiting to see if their appeals against the Competitions and Markets Authority fines actually got them anywhere, because that would sort of shift the balance of power a bit, perhaps. But it's really complicated. It's horrible.
Okay. Let me just see if there's anything else. There's a lot of comments just making some clear points about some of the evidence about liothyronine. I won't go through that with Billy so much. Somebody's, I think Anita's just commenting about the process of going through an exceptional funding request. I don't know, Billy, is that something that rings a bell with you?
I don't know anything about that, I'm afraid. No. Short
No. We're getting to the detail of the pharmacology now.
I mean, we would say on that you know, when we were working with the Regional Medicines Optimisation Committee on the prescribing guidance for liothyronine, they were very clear that they didn't think it was appropriate that liothyronine should be prescribed as a exceptional case, because it's recognised as a cohort of patients who don't get on with levothyroxine, and so it's a real waste of NHS resources to, you know, to put your doctor through the process of having to fill out all those forms and the whole CCG to be involved in that. But we know that some CCGs are still pushing for it to be seen as an exceptional case. And I think if you're put in that position, I would be talking to somebody like the Patients Association for support in making sure that you go through all the stages. But it really shouldn't be necessary. It absolutely should not. But certainly some patients are having that experience, we know.
So what always amazes me is that sometimes patients are sort of seeing their GP almost weekly because they're so unhappy. They go on liothyronine, they're never seen again. You'd be
Yes.
thinking that was a major cost, but that doesn't seem to carry much weight either, I'm afraid.
And it's an interesting sort of description of thyroid patients who are unwell, as they're often described as miserable or unhappy. And actually, these are people who are physically unwell and sometimes mentally unwell as well. I know when I was very unwell with hypothyroidism, I couldn't think straight. I couldn't talk without tears coming out the corner of my eyes. I couldn't string a sentence together. So it's very, very difficult to be taken seriously when you're in that unwell state. But I think we do need to describe patients as unwell and not just as unhappy or miserable, because it's not about a state of mind. It's about the hormones in your body and your body and brain being able to function or not.
Billy, you mentioned the CMA ruling in December, when I think it was 100 million, wasn't it, the fine? Is that right?
100 million.
Yeah. And so did they? Did they? Is there? I presume they appealed. Did they, in terms of the company?
Yeah. So all of the fines that the that the CMA issued last year are being appealed by various parties who are subject to those decisions. I think the question is how long that will take. There isn't a specific timescale, but probably at least a year or two. CMA cases and competition tribunal appeals tend to be very slow. There's another case that's been going on many years and has gone back to the CMA after an appeal, in a case called phenytoin to epilepsy drug. So it can be very slow. But I'd have thought the appeal likely to be heard next year at the latest in at least some of those cases.
Do they actually pay the money first and get it back, or how does it? Well, how does the
No, I think the fine is suspended. I think you may potentially have to put it into an account. That's a good question, actually. I'm not certain on that.
I just know. I mean, also through my other sort of endocrinology, the hydrocortisone was even worse, wasn't it, in terms of the cost? And that suddenly went. That wasn't even. At least the thyroid one was a bit hidden. They sort of did quite quietly, but there was sort of like a 6,000% increase in like a month or something. In the
I think it went from 70p to £88, or something like that. Yeah, that was the most extreme in percentage terms.
Yeah. Anything else on your horizon, Billy? People are interested in what you're going to turn to next, and so your next project.
Well, always interested in things related to this in the pharmaceutical industry. I'm working on a number of things at the moment for the paper that are not related, and I can't really say what they are. But yeah, a variety of topics. Sort of politics and the corporate world are often common themes.
And just in terms of the process, did you sort of have a Watergate type meeting in the car park? How did you start getting your information in terms of?
So with this, I actually really started just by going through the drug tariff and some other documents that get produced with sort of numbers in, and just kind of initially quite crudely crunching them and sitting, just kind of spotting anomalies. And then from there, there was some sort of sources I made and leaked documents and things along the way, but largely with this one, it was a kind of a big document and number crunching exercise, and then just kind of get a sense of what it all means, what the different categories in the drug tariff mean, and what does it mean when this brand name was written there and it isn't anymore, and all of that. How does the NHS price different things, and how does that all work? That was all quite complicated, and these companies initially were saying, well, we don't set the prices, the NHS pays, nothing to do with us, kind of thing, and that's because technically speaking, the prices are set on the basis of the prices charged by wholesalers, but for this category of drug. But if there's obviously one supplier, then the wholesaler's price is the supplier's price, effectively, with a small margin added on. So there were lots of kind of complexities to iron out. And then the odd meeting with insiders who knew I was interested in and thought things were going on that shouldn't be, and wanted to help point me in the right direction.
And did you get the sense within the NHS that they were sort of felt positive about your contribution, or did you sort of feel that you were fighting the system? How did they?
I think they were unusual. I would say unusually grateful. that this, I think there was a recognition that this was a problem that had been ignored for too long or not realized for too long. And although, you know, there was, I think, a reasonable amount of blame for them for not having done something earlier or spotted it or the rest of it, you know, an opportunity was there for them to take action, and you know, so, you know, can be quite a helpful political win to, you know, crack down on these companies who are doing something that, you know, most people would find fairly egregious.
But I mean, it's fair to say, without you and the Times and that article, it's not easy to know. I mean, you did a series, didn't you, and with the various drugs? I remember. I mean, without that, there's not a sense anything would have happened, is there?
No, I think that was, I mean, we did it, it was on the first two stories were on the front page in 2 successive days, which sort of helped build up a bit of steam. We got hold of some of these, not actually the ones I showed today, but some other presentations where these companies were boasting about what they've done and how much they've made. So Sinbin sold Amco, this company they created from merging 2 companies, for I think it was 2.3 billion to Concordia. So there was a lot of money made along the way, just from flipping the companies, let alone the profits that these increased prices generated. That all helped, I think, make the case for when they refer to the CMA. I know the CMA used some of those same documents in their investigation, because you know, it showed that these weren't just one-offs. This was a business model, and it was a kind of conscious exploitative strategy, and they were doing it again and again and again. And I think before, the NHS would have found it easy. One of these price rises, hydrocortisone, was flagged in an article in 2010 just as a standalone price rise. But I think the NHS took the view then that basically we're quite happy with how generics save us money, and maybe there's 1 or 2 anomalies, but the system works quite well. And I think it was only in showing, you know, here's 70 drugs and it's costing you £360 million a year in the inflated costs that they realised this is a serious problem that we need to deal with.
Yeah, it's worth emphasising that point, that you were working with a system here where overall it was seen as a massive advantage in terms of costs. So, as you say, it was these little anomalies, and often in specialties like endocrinology, which is seen as fairly small fry compared to the cardiovascular and sort of oncology market as well. Have you read Empire of Pain and sort of followed the
opioid scandal? Yeah, I've read a few books on that. I mean, I think, you know, that's all of the worst impulses of the industry are kind of on display there. Especially in the US, the marketing abuses, the way doctors push prescriptions and were incentivized to push prescriptions, the way that the evidence of the addictive nature of these drugs wasn't just ignored. I mean, it was sort of exploited to increase prescriptions and increase sales. I mean, I think it's absolutely shocking in scale, and the number of lives that have been affected by that.
Yes, that point was raised by Helen. And then, I mean, obviously with the pandemic, and Nikki's just put PPE exclamation mark. I mean, what did you observe in the pandemic in terms of any lessons that you could have thought? Had you seen any NHS lessons learned from what had gone on before?
That is a good question. I'm not one I've really considered in relation to the NHS. I mean, I think the NHS from a supply perspective was quite effective at ratcheting up delivery of PPE, especially when it was expanded out to care homes as well. There were lots of, and I wrote a lot about this over the last few years, lots of question marks and failures around PPE contracts and how they were awarded and who they were awarded to. But I think on a sort of logistics perspective, that was handled quite well from in terms of distribution, really. I guess just to take the other half of Helen's point, reading that now about trusting pharmaceutical companies. I mean, I think it's important to make the point that I'm not arguing, and the book isn't arguing for a kind of the end of pharmaceutical companies or for that sector to no longer be for profit in any form or anything along those lines. And I think the vaccines and treatments for COVID are, an illustration of how important it is that we have this industry that risk that the capital at risk in drug development is not something that governments can ever take on. And so it's always going to have to be this partnership between industry and the public sector. But I think, this is also an illustration of why it's important we get the balance right. And so for all the abuses that take place in marketing and pricing and other areas, there's a lot of very good and very important science that is done by the industry and that could only be done by the industry. And it's precisely because of that it's important that we, as I say, we get these things right and we restore that sort of social contract I was talking about earlier.
Okay, I think we've sort of covered a lot of different areas. Lorraine, is there anything else that you think we need?
I thought maybe just briefly pick something up that I spotted in the chat earlier, which relates to what Billy was just saying. So there was a petition going around. I don't know if you saw this, Mark, quite recently. I think it was started by Professor Karim Miran at Imperial. And it was a petition asking the government to start manufacturing liothyronine so that it could be made available more cheaply. And someone in the chat was asking if we were aware of that and whether we thought that was a realistic plan. And we shared that petition, but we didn't really sort of push it because our advisors had said just what Billy has just said, that you can't really expect government to start manufacturing medicines. It kind of probably isn't really that practical a solution. And we do know from talking to drug companies that particularly making liothyronine, as Billy said, is quite a complex process. There's probably a sort of a limited number of factories in the world where they can make it, and the government setting up a new one probably doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think the answer to can we ever trust pharmaceutical companies has to be patient voices have to be more heard, and pharmaceutical companies and decision makers in healthcare need to hear patients more. And then I just can't believe that anyone with an ounce of humanity in them would continue to charge prices which make it impossible for patients to get access to treatment when they understand the real human impact on people. So I think we all have to just use our words and be heard.
Yeah, as I said, I think there'd be no problem. Sorry, just say, Billy, there'd be no problem if it was cheap. I think that unfortunately has been the rate limiting, and it's sort of the price increase actually coincided with liothyrone's rebirth, as it were, because it has sort of died a death for many years in terms of my practice. I mean, I don't think, when I'm trying to think outside the short courses we prescribed in thyroid cancer, I don't think I prescribed it in 20 years in my training, and that's my first 10 years as a consultant. So it was just that the 2012 price rise did sort of appear at the time when suddenly it was being thought of again in new ways. So that was a question of timing. But I just don't think our government is going to do that, by the way, Lorraine. But Billy, I'm sure you'll.
Yeah,
no,
well, I
don't think so. We haven't pushed it at all because it doesn't seem realistic.
I think there's a reasonable point there on how realistic it is. I actually do think there is potentially a useful role in having some kind of publicly owned manufacturing facility for generics, if only as a manufacturer of last resort in a situation where you've got a single supplier and it's outrageously expensive, or in cases where the only suppliers had manufacturing problems at their plant and it's going to be 6 months till they can get another supplier, which has also happened to other drugs, and then you have shortages. I mean, going back several decades, a lot of drugs used to be compounded in hospital pharmacies, so the NHS has played a role in making medicines before. There's a factory down in Torbay in the southwest that makes a number of liquid medicines on behalf of a trust down there. I know in Scotland quite a few what are called specials, which is a sort of, as they sound, very specialised small batch products, often in different forms that aren't made. So if somebody can only take a drug in a liquid form and it's only sold as a tablet, they often make those in-house, and that's a lot cheaper than the alternative, the pharmacists, sort of big corporate pharmacists that are used in England. So I think there's a role for it. I don't think it's ever realistic to expect all generics to be made by the NHS, and nor is that desirable, because in a lot of cases they won't be able to make them as cheaply as the market currently does. But I think it could play a useful role. The other thing on the reputation is it's only relatively recently, only really since the late 80s, early 90s, that the pharmaceutical industry has had a very poor reputation, and that's got worse up until the start of the pandemic, and it's now recovered a bit. But before then, drug companies were regularly being voted the most admirable company in America, and similar accolades. So it's not unrealistic to expect that situation to happen. It just needs to look at what's gone wrong since then, and as I say, correct the abuses and rebalance its focus, and everyone can be much happier.
Yeah, that does take me back. The pharmacy in your hospital sometimes just make that liquid version of something from somewhere, but it always had a shelf life of about a week, so it wasn't the best practical option. But they in the old days they did help you out occasionally.
That's fascinating.
Okay, Lorraine, I've not seen anything else. Have you seen anything else people wanted to add as a last comment, or?
People saying they think there should be more accountability and transparency, which I think is exactly what Billy said, and I think we all agree with that. Yeah.
Okay, well, if you're happy, Lorraine, I'll sort of close. Is that okay?
Yeah, I was just going to say a little bit about
stuff that's coming up in May. So just to say that some of my notes here about Thyroid Awareness Week, and do you want to just mention International Thyroid Awareness Week and World Thyroid Day, which is towards the end of May?
Yeah, so the 25th of May is World Thyroid Day, and then it's International Thyroid Awareness Week up until the 31st of May. And our theme for this year is going to be Let's Talk About Thyroid Health. And we're going to be asking people to pledge that they will talk about their thyroid, or talk about thyroid health generally during that week. So please have a think about how you might be able to get involved with that. Last year and then the year before, a few of us ran around dressed up as butterflies, and that was interesting, sort of getting the point across that the thyroid is a butterfly-shaped gland. But I don't know if I've got the energy to do that again this year, but if anyone else does, that'd be great. But maybe have like a tea party or something with friends and get together, or get together with your family and let's talk about thyroid, and people like yourself, Mark, coming from the expert perspective as well. It would be great if you could think about anything that you could do to have more conversations about thyroid disease during that week, and let's all do everything that we can to raise awareness. We're hoping to do a couple of events. I'm going to be doing a seaside walk and probably a picnic lunch here in Broadstairs at some point that week. And if we can get a venue confirmed, we'll be doing something in London as well. There'll be some online seminars from Thyroid Federation International, probably. I'm sure British Thyroid Foundation and the other groups will all do stuff. So yeah, something to look forward to. It's our week. Let's make some noise.
So just finally, just to thank everyone for coming and joining, and I hope you found it useful. We've done our best. A massive thank you for Karen, who's been heroically cutting and pasting comments, and she's only did there are a few typos. A bit of feedback for you, Karen, later. But thank you ever so much for your efforts, and I hope we tried to capture the spirit, if not the specific questions of everyone. Some questions were a bit specific. I tried to give it a more broader brief. So thank you to Karen for trying to sort that out and help me out. A massive thank you to Lorraine as well for organising tonight, and for all her efforts to try and raise thyroid awareness, not just in that week, but throughout the whole year. And so thank you for all your efforts. And then finally, a really big thanks to Billy. And actually, I'm just sort of realising, Billy, that if we had a Nobel Prize for thyroid contributions, I think we probably would win it, because single-handedly, your efforts and the Times, which of course is my favourite newspaper, Billy, I read it every day religiously, looking for any of your pieces as they pop up. Is that it's you've done so much actually to help bring this issue to really some fruition, and if for no other reason to get a price of something reduced from 261 to 61 in 4 years is not bad going, and I suspect it will be coming down even further over the coming months. So a really massive thank you. Everyone needs to buy his book. It's very good, and it's got lots of other stuff. We've been very T3 focus tonight, but it's got a much wider, bigger picture of the pharmaceutical industry. And as I say, it does have a balanced view. It's not a complete slagging off. It does actually give the positives of what pharmaceutical industry does, but it actually has exposed sort of a side of them that that has really been detrimental to many patients over many years when they've done so much good in other ways. So thank you ever so much for your time tonight, Billy. It was really good of you, and nice to know you're in East London, so you're getting a bit closer to West Ham. Are you a West Ham fan as well?
I'm not. I'm a Tottenham fan, I'm afraid. So
okay,
I'm
glad you told me that at the end, Billy. Otherwise, your introduction would have been a lot worse. And just thank you everyone. And just to say, there's Lorraine's just reminded me that there was over £300 made for the Thyroid Trust tonight, just from contributions from people donating for taking part. So, thank you very much, and good night all. Thank you very much, Lorraine.
Thank you so much, Mark. You've been an amazing host. Thank you very, very much for giving up your time to do this.
It's a pleasure.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thanks very much, Billy. Take care.